In the mountains of Appalachia, some stories were never written down. Not because they were forgotten, but because everyone who knew them was too afraid to speak. 3 sisters, Martha, Clara, and June, only 21 years old, left behind a trail of fear so chilling that whole towns agreed to erase their names from local history. What they did, and what was covered up, has remained hidden for nearly a century. Tonight, we reopen the pages no one dared to keep. Before we begin, over 70% of viewers who watch these videos aren't subscribed. If you enjoy chilling true stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I love seeing our community from all around the world. They say the mountains remember everything. Every scream, every secret, every soul that vanished into the mist and never returned. But there are some stories the mountains refuse to tell. Stories so dark that even the oldest trees seem to lean away from the places where they happened. This is one of those stories. The year was 1897. Deep in the Appalachian wilderness, where 3 states touched but no law truly reached, there stood a cabin that locals would cross a frozen river to avoid. Inside that cabin lived 3 sisters, Martha, Clara, and June Holloway, all 21 years old. Triplets, born on the same stormy October night when, as the midwife later whispered, the devil himself seemed to be pacing on the roof. By the time their story ended, 17 people had disappeared. 17 souls who made the mistake of trusting the wrong smile, accepting the wrong invitation, following the wrong light through the woods. But before we get to the blood-soaked conclusion, we need to understand how 3 young women, described by those who survived as beautiful as morning mist and twice as cold, became something that history itself tried to forget. Because what Martha, Clara, and June Holloway did wasn't just murder. It was something far more calculated, far more twisted, and far more evil than anything the good people of Ridgecrest County could comprehend. And by the time the truth came out, it was almost too late. My name doesn't matter. I'm just the one who found the journals. The one who pieced together the newspaper clippings, the trial transcripts that were sealed, the letters that were never sent, and the confessions that were buried in a courthouse basement for over a century. This is their story. Every word of it true. Every detail more disturbing than the last. And it starts, as all the worst stories do, with a childhood that should have been a warning. The Holloway triplets were born on October 31st, 1876, in a cabin so remote that their mother, Sarah Holloway, nearly died giving birth with no one but her husband Thomas to help. They came into the world during a thunderstorm so violent that trees split in half, and according to Thomas's journal, which I found hidden in the walls of the old County Historical Society, each baby was born with the caul still over their face. Now, for those who don't know, being born with the caul means the amniotic sac is still covering the baby's head when they emerge. In Appalachian folklore, this was considered either a great blessing or a terrible curse. The child would either have the gift of second sight, or they would be touched by something darker. Thomas Holloway believed it was a blessing. He was wrong. Martha was born first at midnight exactly. Clara followed 3 minutes later. June came last after their mother had screamed that there couldn't possibly be another one. 3 identical girls with black hair and eyes so dark they look like chips of obsidian. Beautiful babies, everyone agreed. Unnaturally beautiful. The Holloway family lived on a plot of land that had belonged to Thomas's father and his father before him. 60 acres of rocky mountainside, thick forest and a creek that ran cold even in August. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles away through treacherous terrain. The nearest town, Ridgecrest, was a 7-mile journey that took half a day on horseback. Thomas Holloway was a quiet man who kept to himself. He raised hogs, grew tobacco, and made moonshine that he sold to a distributor who came once a month. He wasn't a bad man by all accounts, just isolated, superstitious, and perhaps not quite prepared for what his daughters would become. Sarah Holloway was different. According to letters written by her sister, who lived in Virginia and visited only once after the triplets were born, Sarah changed after giving birth. She became withdrawn, fearful, and obsessed with protecting her daughters from something she couldn't name. She would stand at the window for hours watching the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. At night, she would check on the girls repeatedly, counting them as if one might have been replaced by something else. The sister's letter, dated April 1877, described her visit in disturbing detail. "The babies are beautiful, but there is something wrong with them, though I cannot say what. They do not cry properly. When one begins to fuss, the other two stare at her until she stops. They are only 6 months old, but they watch people with the awareness of much older children. Sarah will not leave them alone for even a moment. She whispers to them constantly, prayers, I think, though in no language I recognize. Thomas pretends not to notice. I will not return to that house." She never did, and she burned all of Sarah's subsequent letters without reading them. The triplets grew up in near total isolation. Thomas educated them himself using books he ordered from a catalog. They learned to read, write, and cipher. They learned the Bible, though whether they believed it was another matter. They learned the skills they would need for mountain life: preserving food, sewing, tending animals, identifying edible and poisonous plants. But they also learned something else, something their parents never intended to teach them. They learned that they were different, special, set apart, and they learned how easy it was to hurt things. The first documented incident occurred when the triplets were 7 years old. The Holloway family owned a dozen chickens, 3 hogs, and a milk cow named Bess. The animals were essential to their survival. Without them, the family would have no eggs, no meat, no milk, and no income from selling surplus. One morning in June 1883, Thomas went to milk Bess and found her dead in the barn. But not just dead, mutilated. Her udders had been cut off. Her eyes had been removed. Her tongue had been torn out. The violence of it was shocking, and the precision suggested it hadn't been done by any animal. Thomas immediately suspected wolves or a panther, though he knew in his heart that no natural predator killed like this. Nothing had eaten any part of the cow. This was killing for its own sake. He buried Bess and tried to keep the incident from Sarah, who was already fragile, but she knew. She always knew when something was wrong. 3 days later, all 12 chickens were found dead. Their necks had been wrung and they'd been arranged in a circle in the chicken coop, all facing inward toward a crude symbol scratched in the dirt. Thomas recognized it from somewhere but couldn't place it. Later, research would reveal it was a sigil from medieval grimoires, used in summoning rituals. How 7-year-olds in the remote Appalachian wilderness would know such a symbol remains unexplained. Thomas questioned the girls. They stood before him in identical dresses Sarah had sewn, their faces blank, their dark eyes revealing nothing. Each swore she knew nothing about the chickens. Each swore she had been in bed all night. Each looked at her sisters as if daring them to contradict her. Thomas wanted to believe them. He needed to believe them. So he blamed it on vandals. He told Sarah it must have been someone from town, someone with a grudge. He replaced the chickens and bought another cow. He built stronger locks on the barn. It didn't help. Over the next 2 years, the Holloway farm experienced a series of inexplicable incidents. Animals went missing or turned up dead in ways that suggested human intervention. Tools vanished and reappeared in strange places. Food rotted overnight in sealed containers. The well water would occasionally taste of something bitter and wrong, forcing the family to haul water from the creek for days until it cleared. And Sarah deteriorated. By the triplets' 9th birthday, Sarah Holloway barely left her bed. She had become gaunt, hollow-eyed, and prone to fits of screaming in which she would beg Thomas to send the girls away. "They're not right," she would sob. "They've never been right. Something came in with them that night. Something got into them while they were still inside me. We have to send them away before it's too late." Thomas refused. They were his daughters. He loved them. He couldn't see what Sarah saw, or perhaps he refused to see it. The local doctor who made a house call in November 1885 diagnosed Sarah with hysteria and melancholia. He prescribed bed rest and a tonic of dubious ingredients. In his notes, which survived in the county medical records, he wrote, "Patient displays extreme paranoia centered on her children. Claims they speak to things that are not there and that they know things they could not possibly know. Attributes to them a malevolent intelligence unusual for their age. Patient may be suffering from delayed onset of purple psychosis. Husband appears in denial. The children themselves appear normal if unusually composed for 9-year-olds. Recommend patient be separated from children for her own mental health, but husband refuses." Sarah Holloway died 3 months later, in February 1886. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but those who prepared her body for burial noted something strange. She had lost an alarming amount of weight in a very short time, and her face bore an expression of absolute terror that remained fixed even after death. Thomas was devastated. The triplets, according to all witnesses, showed no emotion whatsoever. They stood at their mother's grave in matching black dresses, their faces blank, their eyes dry. They didn't cry. They didn't comfort their father. They simply stood there, still as statues, while the preacher said words about God's mysterious ways and eternal rest. After the funeral, the 3 girls walked back to the cabin hand, a unit of 3 that needed no one else. Thomas began drinking more of his own moonshine than he sold, and the triplets, now alone with a father who was too grief-stricken and drunk to pay them much attention, began to explore the darker impulses that had always lived inside them. Between the ages of 10 and 15, Martha, Clara, and June Holloway existed in a state of near-complete freedom. Thomas Holloway had essentially given up. He maintained the basic functions of the farm, made his moonshine, and drank enough to sleep through the night without dreaming of his dead wife. The triplets, meanwhile, educated themselves in ways that would have horrified any proper parent. They had found a trunk in the attic, hidden beneath old blankets and tools. Inside was a collection of books that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather, a man who had died before Thomas was born, and about whom the family rarely spoke. The books were unlike any the girls had seen in their father's modest library. Grimoires, occult texts, treatises on dark magic and demonology. Books that detailed rituals for summoning, binding, and controlling entities from beyond the veil. books that described in clinical detail the properties of human blood, bone, and flesh when used in certain ceremonies. Books that had been banned, burned, and condemned by both church and state. The triplets devoured them. Now, I want to be clear here. There's debate among those who've studied this case about whether the Holloway sisters truly believed in the supernatural elements they later claimed motivated their actions, or whether they simply used occult trappings to justify their own sadistic impulses. I've read everything: the journals, the trial testimonies, the psychological evaluations. My conclusion? It doesn't matter. Whether they were trying to summon demons or simply enjoyed the theater of it, the result was the same. They started with animals from the surrounding forest. Rabbits, squirrels, possums. They would trap them and conduct experiments in a shed behind the cabin that their father never entered. What they did to those animals is documented in Martha's journal, which was later entered into evidence. I won't detail it here, except to say that it demonstrated a progression. First simple killing, then vivisection, then more elaborate forms of torture designed to keep the animal alive as long as possible. They kept detailed notes, drew diagrams, refined their techniques. Clara, who emerges in the journals as perhaps the most intellectual of the three, began to theorize about pain and consciousness. She wrote lengthy passages about the nature of suffering and whether extreme agony might open doorways to other realms. She was particularly interested in the moment of death, that threshold between life and whatever comes after, and whether it could be prolonged, studied, and even exploited. June was different. Where Martha and Clara approached their activities with cold scientific curiosity, June seemed to derive genuine pleasure from the suffering itself. Her journal entries are shorter, more emotional, filled with descriptions of the sounds the animals made and how those sounds made her feel. Alive, she wrote repeatedly. Finally alive. As they entered their teenage years, the sisters became increasingly bold. They expanded their range, sometimes traveling miles from home to trap larger animals. Once they killed a neighbor's hunting dog. Another time they took a fawn from the woods, and its mother's cries could be heard for 2 days until she finally wandered away. But animals were no longer enough. The first human disappearance occurred in September 1891, when the triplets were 15 years old. His name was Daniel McKinney. He was a traveling peddler, 43 years old, who made a circuit through the mountain communities selling dry goods, medicines, and news from the outside world. He was well-liked, reliable, and had a wife and 3 children waiting for him in Asheville. He was last seen heading up the mountain trail toward the Holloway cabin. Thomas had been expecting him, as he usually traded moonshine for supplies. Daniel never arrived in town on the other side of the mountain. Search parties looked for 2 weeks, but found nothing. The assumption was that Daniel had either fallen from a cliff — there were several dangerous spots along the mountain trails — or been attacked by an animal. His body was never recovered. What no one knew at the time was that Daniel McKinney had made it to the Holloway cabin. Thomas had been passed out drunk in the house. The triplets had been the ones to greet him. Martha's journal, discovered years later, describes what happened. He came as father said he would, a soft man, round in the middle, with a ready smile and a trusting nature. Those are the ones who see 3 young girls and think children instead of threat. We invited him to rest while we woke our father. We offered him water. Clara prepared it with the tincture we had been refining. He drank deeply. Within minutes, he could not move his limbs, though he remained conscious. This is important. Consciousness without the ability to resist. June was pleased. We carried him to the shed, which took all three of us working together. He is there now as I write this, alive, aware, and ours to learn from. The grimoires speak of blood sacrifice and the power it releases. We will test this. We will document everything, and when we are finished, the mountain will have another secret to keep. The journal entry ends there. The next entry, dated 3 days later, is clinically detailed and absolutely horrifying in its description of what the sisters did to Daniel McKinney over a period of 72 hours. I will not reproduce it here. When they were finished, they disposed of his body in a way that would become their signature. They burned it, crushed the bones, and scattered the remains in multiple locations deep in the forest. His wagon, horse, and goods they pushed into a ravine and covered with rocks and brush. It wouldn't be found for 6 years. The sisters were 15 years old, and they had just discovered what they were truly capable of. After Daniel McKinney, there was a gap of nearly a year before the next disappearance. This wasn't due to conscience or hesitation. The journals make clear the sisters had neither. Rather, they were being strategic. They had learned from this first kill that patience was essential. Bodies brought searches. Searches brought attention. Attention was dangerous. So they waited. They refined their approach. And they chose their next victim very, very carefully. Her name was Ida Thornton, a widow of 52 who lived alone in a cabin about 6 miles from the Holloways. She was reclusive, had no living children, and her nearest relative was a cousin 3 counties away who hadn't visited in years. In other words, she was someone who might go unnoticed for quite some time. The sisters encountered Ida in town during one of their rare visits to Ridgecrest. This trip, in August 1892, was notable because it was one of the first times the triplets had been seen in public since their mother's death. They had grown into striking young women of 16, tall, dark-haired, and identical to a degree that unnerved people. But they were also polite, soft-spoken, and seemingly shy. Ida Thornton, who sold preserves and honey at the town market, was kind to them. She complimented their dresses. She gave them a jar of honey free of charge. She mentioned casually that she lived alone and sometimes found it lonely. The sisters filed this information away. 2 months later, in October, Martha knocked on Ida Thornton's door. She was alone, or seemed to be. Clara and June were actually hidden nearby, watching. Martha explained that she had gotten turned around in the woods while foraging for herbs and had twisted her ankle. Could she rest for a moment and perhaps borrow some water? Ida, being a decent person, immediately invited Martha inside. That was the mistake. Clara and June entered within minutes, claiming they had been searching for their sister. Ida, now hosting all 3 triplets, offered them food and conversation. The sisters were charming. They asked about Ida's life, her late husband, her preserves. They admired her home. They made her feel special, important, seen. When Ida went to the kitchen to prepare tea, June added the tincture to her cup. What followed was methodical. The sisters had learned from Daniel McKinney's case. They had improved their paralytic compound. They had better tools. They had more experience. And they had questions. Specific questions about human physiology that their books could not answer, and that only direct experimentation could satisfy. Ida Thornton's remains were never found. The few people who knew her assumed she had either died alone in her cabin, not uncommon for elderly mountain folk, or had gone to live with a relative. Her cabin sat undisturbed for months until eventually someone from town came to investigate, found it empty, and that was that. 2 people had now vanished completely, and no one suspected murder. No one suspected 3 teenage girls who lived in isolation with their drunk father. No one connected the disappearances at all. The sisters, emboldened, began to hunt more frequently. To understand what Martha, Clara, and June Holloway became, we need to examine their methodology. This isn't gratuitous. It's necessary to comprehend the calculated nature of their evil. These were not crimes of passion or impulse. They were planned, executed, and documented with scientific precision. The sisters developed a system with 3 distinct phases: selection, capture, and experimentation. The sisters chose victims based on specific criteria. They needed people who would not be immediately missed, whose disappearance could be explained by accident or departure. Traveling merchants, drifters, elderly recluses, people passing through the area with no deep connections. They avoided anyone with strong family ties or regular schedules that would prompt quick investigations. They also selected for vulnerability, the elderly, the naive, the overly trusting, people who would accept help from young women without suspicion. Martha's journal contains a chilling phrase that became their motto: "The most dangerous predator is the one nobody fears." The sisters would encounter potential victims in town or along the mountain roads. They would assess them, sometimes over weeks or months, learning their habits and circumstances. June had a particular talent for extracting information without seeming nosy. She would chat casually with people, and they would tell her everything: where they lived, whether they lived alone, when they would be traveling through the area. The tincture they used was a refined version of something Clara had found in one of the grimoires. The base was likely derived from certain mushrooms and plants native to the region, possibly containing compounds similar to muscarine or other paralytic alkaloids. Clara's journal suggests she experimented extensively to create a compound that would paralyze without killing, that would work quickly but last for hours, and that had minimal taste when mixed with water or alcohol. The capture itself was always performed in location away from witnesses. The sisters would lure the victim to their cabin on some pretext, or occasionally, as with Ida Thornton, would visit the victim's remote home. Once the tincture took effect, transportation was relatively simple for 3 strong young women working together. They always cleaned the scene meticulously. Any sign of struggle was eliminated. Any witnesses, which were rare in that isolated area, were avoided completely. This is the hardest part to discuss, but it's necessary to understand what the Holloway sisters were. They had converted the shed behind their cabin into what can only be described as a laboratory. Over time, they had acquired tools, some ordered through catalogs under false names, some stolen, some improvised. Surgical implements, restraints, a table modified for their purposes, journals for recording observations, jars of various chemicals and compounds. What they did to their victims was framed in their journals as experimentation. They were testing the limits of human endurance. They were exploring the relationship between pain and consciousness. They were attempting rituals from their grimoires to see if they would work. But the journals also reveal something else. They enjoyed it. All 3 of them, though in different ways. Martha was the leader, the organizer. She approached each session with clinical detachment, recording observations, timing responses, noting when certain thresholds were crossed. She wrote as though she were conducting laboratory research, using passive language to describe horrors. The subject remained conscious for approximately 6 hours after response to stimuli decreased incrementally. Terminal phase was reached at Clara was the intellectual. She theorized, constantly trying to find patterns and meaning. She cross-referenced their findings with the grimoires, looking for validation of the occult claims about blood, pain, and death opening doors to other realms. She was the one who insisted on certain rituals being performed, certain symbols being drawn, certain words being spoken. June was the enthusiast. Her journal entries are visceral and disturbing in their honesty. She didn't pretend to scientific objectivity. She reveled in the power, the control, the sounds and sights of suffering. Her writings are those of someone who had found their purpose in life, and it was terrible. Between 1892 and 1897, the sisters refined their process. They became more efficient, more careful, more bold, and the body count rose. 17 people disappeared in Ridgecrest County and the surrounding areas between 1891 and 1897. Not all of them can be definitively connected to the Holloway sisters, but evidence suggests they were responsible for at least 13, possibly all 17. Let me tell you about some of them. Samuel Harris, age 67, disappeared November 1892. A retired timber worker who lived alone. Last seen heading up the mountain to check his trap line. His cabin was found empty 3 weeks later. The Holloway Journals reference an old man who knew the woods and describe him as surprisingly strong for his age and resilient beyond expectations. Rebecca Walsh, age 29, disappeared April 1893. A schoolteacher traveling to a new position in Tennessee. She stopped in Ridgecrest to rest and resupply. Several people saw her talking with 3 identical young women at the general store. She never reached Tennessee. Her family searched for months. In Martha's journal, the first educated one, she recognized one of Clara's books when she saw it in the shed. That was her mistake, letting us know she understood what she was seeing. Thomas Garrett and his son James, ages 45 and 16, disappeared June 1893. Traveling tinkers. This was the only time the sisters took 2 people simultaneously, and June's journal suggests it was nearly a disaster. The father fought hard despite the tincture, and the son had to be subdued separately. The journals indicate the sisters learned they needed to adjust dosage based on body weight. We have learned the importance of mathematics, Clara wrote. 2 subjects simultaneously presents complications but also opportunities for comparative study. Mary Catherine Doyle, age 58, disappeared September 1893. Another widow living alone. She made the mistake of hiring the triplets to help with her fall canning. The sisters worked for 2 days, were paid, left, and returned that night. Mary Catherine's cabin burned down 3 weeks later, a suspicious fire that destroyed any evidence. The journals confirm they had taken her before setting the fire to cover traces of their presence. Henry Morrison, age 34, disappeared December 1893. A traveling preacher. His Bible was later found in the Holloway shed, filled with what appeared to be deliberate blasphemies written in margins. Whether the sisters wrote them or forced him to write them is unclear. Clara's journal. He prayed until he couldn't form words. Then he prayed in his mind. We could see it in his eyes. We are curious whether his God heard him. We suspect not, or suspect his God does not care. David and Martha Yates, ages 52 and 49, disappeared together March 1894. A married couple who had recently moved to the area. They had no children and few friends. They simply vanished from their small farm. Their livestock was found dead a week later. Martha Holloway wrote, "Shared experience. We learned one is aware of the other. This adds a dimension we had not anticipated. June found it particularly satisfying." And so on, and so on, and so on. Each name represents a life, a person with memories, hopes, fears, people who were someone's child, possibly someone's parent, possibly someone's friend or spouse. People who simply had the profound misfortune to cross paths with three young women who had cultivated evil into an art form. The victims ranged from 16 to 67 years old. 7 women, 10 men. Some were travelers, some were locals. Some vanished without a trace. Some left behind signs of struggle that were never properly investigated. And through it all, the Holloway sisters remained invisible. 3 beautiful, quiet girls who lived on an isolated mountain farm with their tragic, drunken father. When they came to town, which was rarely, they were polite and proper. They attended church occasionally. They caused no disturbances. No one suspected. No one even imagined. Until Thomas Holloway sobered up just enough to stumble into their shed one October evening in 1897. October 14th, 1897. The triplets' 21st birthday was 2 weeks away. They had been active for 6 years. 13 confirmed victims, possibly more. And they had become complacent. Thomas Holloway had been drunk for the better part of a decade. After Sarah's death, he had essentially ceased functioning as a parent. He made enough moonshine to sell and enough to keep himself numb. He barely spoke to his daughters. He ate the meals they prepared for him, wore the clothes they washed for him, and existed in a fog of alcohol and grief. But even the deepest drunk has moments of unwanted clarity. On this particular evening, Thomas had run out of moonshine. His still was behind the shed, the same shed the sisters had converted to their laboratory. He hadn't been back there in months. The girls always brought him his product. But he was desperate, shaking from withdrawal, and needed to check if there was any mash ready to run. The shed door was locked. It was never locked. Thomas still had his key, though he couldn't remember the last time he'd used it. What he found inside would shatter what remained of his mind. According to Thomas's later testimony, given in a state of near catatonia to the sheriff, the shed had been transformed into something incomprehensible. The walls were covered in symbols drawn in what appeared to be dried blood. There were jars everywhere containing things he couldn't identify and didn't want to. There were books open to pages showing diagrams that looked like nothing belonging to the natural world. There were tools, surgical instruments, things that gleamed in the lamplight the sisters had left burning. And there was a table in the center of the room with restraints and stains so dark and extensive that even someone as far gone as Thomas knew what they meant. But worst of all, there was a man. He was alive, barely. Restrained. Mutilated in ways Thomas's mind refused to fully process. And he was conscious. His eyes met Thomas's eyes, and in them was a pleading so desperate that Thomas staggered backward. The man's name was Michael Brennan. He was a surveyor from out of state, mapping the mountain region for a mining company. He had been missing for 4 days. He had been in the Holloway shed for 3 of them. Thomas stood frozen, his mind trying to reconcile what he was seeing with any kind of reality. And then he heard voices approaching, his daughter's voices, laughing about something. Coming back to the shed, he ran. Thomas Holloway ran down the mountain in the dark, stumbling, falling, scrambling back up. He ran until he reached the nearest neighbor, Samuel Pritchard, 4 miles away. He pounded on the door in the middle of the night, incoherent and wild-eyed. It took Pritchard an hour to understand what Thomas was trying to say. When he finally did, he sent his eldest son to ride to town for the sheriff, while he tried to calm Thomas down enough to make sense. By the time Sheriff William Clayton arrived at dawn with 3 deputies, the Holloway sisters were gone. Sheriff William Clayton was 56 years old. He had been the law in Ridgecrest County for 23 years. He had dealt with moonshine runners, property disputes, the occasional knife fight outside a saloon, and 1 murder. A husband who shot his wife's lover in a fit of rage, then immediately turned himself in. He was not prepared for what he found at the Holloway cabin. The house itself was tidy, almost obsessively clean. 3 bedrooms, each containing an identical bed with identical quilts. Identical dresses hung in identical wardrobes. The kitchen was orderly. The sitting room contained books, some normal and some decidedly not. A Bible sat on a table, and one of the deputies noted that certain passages had been underlined, all relating to punishment, wrath, and suffering. Then they went to the shed. Deputy James Holcomb, who would later resign his position and leave the county entirely, described it in his written report. "I have no words that can properly convey what we found. The sheriff ordered us to document everything, but I found myself unable to look directly at much of it. The smell alone was enough to make 2 of us vomit before we'd even fully entered. What those girls had done in that place. It wasn't human. It couldn't be human. But the evidence proved otherwise." Michael Brennan was still alive. Barely. He was unable to speak. Whether from trauma or physical damage, the doctor who later examined him couldn't determine. He would never recover. He spent the remaining 4 months of his life in a state of complete withdrawal, staring at nothing, responding to nothing. He died in February 1898, officially from infection and organ failure, but really from having experienced something no human being should experience, and surviving just long enough to wish they hadn't. In the shed, the sheriff's team found the journals. 3 of them, 1 for each sister, filled with meticulous descriptions of their activities over 6 years. They found the grimoires and occult texts. They found the tools. They found jars containing things that had to be sent to a larger city for identification. Some were organs, some were other body parts, some were chemical compounds. They found maps with locations marked, 17 in total. Each mark corresponded to a missing person case. The sheriff realized with growing horror that what they were looking at was a record of a killing spree that had gone undetected for years. And they found evidence that helped them understand how the sisters had disposed of their victims. In a cave about a mile from the cabin, they found bones. Lots of bones. Some were animal, but many were human. They were broken, burned, scattered, making identification nearly impossible with 1897 forensic techniques. The search expanded. More deputies were called in from neighboring counties. The state police were notified. It became the largest manhunt in the region's history. But Martha, Clara, and June Holloway had vanished completely. They had a 12-hour head start. They knew the mountains better than anyone. And they had been planning their escape route for years. The journals made this clear. They had supplies cached in various locations. They had money saved from selling their father's moonshine. He had been too drunk to notice. They had maps and plans for multiple contingencies. For 3 weeks, search parties combed the mountains. They found some of the cache supplies evidence that the sisters had passed through certain areas. But the trail always went cold. It was as if the mountain itself was protecting them. Reports came in from other areas. 3 young women matching their description were seen in a town 40 miles away, then in another town 60 miles in a different direction, then crossing a state line, then boarding a train, then vanishing again. The problem was that every report involved identical triplets, which made them both distinctive and confusing. Witnesses could never be sure which one they had seen, or if they had seen all 3, or if they had seen the Holloways at all, versus 3 unrelated sisters who happened to look alike. The manhunt continued through the winter, but hope was fading. December 1897 through February 1898 was a period of frustration for law enforcement and terror for the mountain communities. Every reported sighting led nowhere. Every promising lead evaporated. The Holloway sisters had become ghosts, or perhaps they had always been ghosts and the world was only now realizing it. Sheriff Clayton became obsessed with the case. His wife later said he barely slept, spending his nights reading and rereading the journals, trying to understand the minds that had written them. He was looking for patterns, for clues about where they might have gone, what they might do next. What he found instead was something that chilled him even more than the descriptions of murder. The journals contained plans, not just for the killings they had already committed, but for future projects. The sisters had been escalating. Their experiments were becoming more elaborate, their goals more ambitious. Martha had written extensively about wanting to acquire their own property somewhere even more remote, where they could expand their operations. Clara had outlined ideas for new compounds, new techniques, new rituals she wanted to attempt. June had simply written, over and over in different entries, "This is only the beginning." Clayton realized that the sisters hadn't stopped because they wanted to. They had stopped because they'd been interrupted, and they would start again as soon as they had the opportunity. He sent warnings to law enforcement agencies across multiple states. He distributed descriptions and asked that any reports of similar crimes or suspicious disappearances be forwarded to him. He became the regional expert on the Holloway case, a role he never wanted but couldn't abandon. Meanwhile, the people of Ridgecrest County tried to return to normal life, but the shadow of what had happened hung over everything. Property values plummeted in the area around the Holloway cabin. Several families moved away entirely. Church attendance increased dramatically. People needed to believe in something good after learning what evil had been living among them. The Holloway cabin itself became a source of morbid fascination. Despite the sheriff's orders that it remain secured as evidence, people would sneak onto the property. Some were simply curious. Others believed there was something valuable hidden there. Rumors spread that the sisters had kept money or jewelry taken from their victims. The shed was eventually burned down on Sheriff Clayton's orders. He couldn't bring himself to leave it standing. The cabin itself remained, slowly deteriorating, a monument to darkness. And then, in March 1898, the first letter arrived. It was addressed to Sheriff Clayton, postmarked from a town in Missouri. The handwriting was elegant, careful, clearly feminine. It read, "Dear Sheriff Clayton, we read about our father's death in the newspaper. We assume you believe this news will distress us. It does not. He was weak, as all men are weak when confronted with difficult truths. He chose ignorance for years and then chose cowardice in the end. We mourn neither. We write to correct certain misunderstandings that have appeared in the press accounts of our work. We are not insane. We are not possessed. We are not victims of circumstance or corrupted by our isolation. We are simply clear-eyed about the nature of reality in ways that others refuse to be. The world is not as people pretend it is. There are no benevolent gods watching over humanity. There is no inherent meaning or purpose. There is only power and the will to use it. We chose to explore what that power means, and we have no regrets. You will not find us. We are careful, patient, and far more intelligent than you give us credit for. We have resources you do not suspect and skills you cannot imagine. We have survived, and we will continue to survive. This will be our only communication. Do not bother attempting to trace this letter. By the time you receive it, we will be gone from this place and the trail will be cold once again. One last thing, Sheriff. We saw you. Before we left that night, we watched from the woods as you and your men arrived at our home. We could have killed you. We were that close. We chose not to, not from mercy, but because you are more useful to us alive, as a cautionary tale. Remember that. Remember that you lived because we allowed it. We remain, as always, students of the great work. M, C, and J. Sheriff Clayton received this letter on March 15, 1898. He immediately contacted authorities in Missouri, but as the letter had predicted, the sisters were long gone from wherever they had been when they posted it. The postmark itself might have been a misdirection. There was no way to know if they had actually been in Missouri at all, or if they had arranged for someone else to mail it for them. The letter was published in newspapers across several states, which was exactly what the sisters had wanted. They became notorious. They became legends. And in becoming legends, they became impossible to find. Every reported sighting was now tainted by the publicity, with frauds and attention seekers muddying the waters. The letter also created a new fear. They were still out there, still free, still capable of continuing their work. And the terrible question that kept Sheriff Clayton awake at night: had they continued? Were people disappearing in other places? People whose disappearances weren't connected to the Holloway sisters because no one knew to make the connection? It was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. One of the unintended consequences of the Holloway case becoming national news was the emergence of copycat crimes and false confessions. The lurid details of the case, sensationalized in newspapers and dime novels, created a twisted fascination. In April 1898, a woman in Kentucky confessed to being Clara Holloway. She was arrested, interrogated, and eventually proved to be a mentally unstable person seeking attention. She bore no physical resemblance to the Holloway sisters and knew only what had been published in newspapers. In June 1898, a series of animal mutilations in Virginia was attributed to the Holloway sisters. Investigators eventually determined it was the work of local teenagers who were mimicking what they had read about. In September 1898, 3 young women were arrested in Tennessee on suspicion of being the Holloway sisters. They were held for 3 days before their identities were verified. They were sisters, but not the ones being sought. The experience traumatized them, and they sued the county for false imprisonment. These cases and dozens more like them had 2 effects. They kept the Holloway story in the public consciousness, and they made actual investigation nearly impossible. Real leads were buried under avalanches of false reports. Sheriff Clayton, meanwhile, had not given up. He had compiled a comprehensive file on the case. Every piece of evidence, every journal entry, every witness statement. He had created psychological profiles of each sister, trying to predict their behavior. He corresponded with alienists and criminologists, seeking expert opinions on where women like this might go and what they might do. The consensus among the experts was grim. Women capable of what the Holloway sisters had done rarely reformed. They might lie dormant for periods, but the impulses that drove them would eventually resurface. If they were still alive, they were still dangerous. Clayton also investigated the sisters' background more thoroughly. He interviewed distant relatives, tracked down people who had known the Holloway family before Sarah's death, and tried to find any clue about what had created these three monsters. What he discovered was frustrating in its mundanity. There was no dramatic abuse, no clear trauma. Thomas had been a decent father before his wife's death, and Sarah had been an ordinary, if anxious, mother. The extended family showed no signs of mental illness or criminality. The sisters' childhood, aside from its isolation, seemed unremarkable. The grimoires found in their shed had belonged to Thomas's grandfather, but research into that man's life revealed nothing sinister. He had been eccentric, interested in folk magic and occult philosophy, but there was no evidence he had ever acted on any of it. The books were curiosities, nothing more. It was as if the sisters had simply been born wrong, born with something missing that should have been there, or something extra that shouldn't have been. Nature, not nurture, had created them. This was a deeply unsatisfying conclusion for everyone involved. People wanted a reason. They wanted to believe that such evil required explanation, required cause and effect. The alternative that some people are simply evil, that monsters can emerge from ordinary circumstances for no discernible reason, was too frightening to accept. But the evidence suggested exactly that. As 1898 turned into 1899 and 1899 turned into 1900, the case grew cold. Sightings continued, but none were verified. Sheriff Clayton retired in 1901, his health broken by stress and obsession. He died in 1903, and his last words to his wife were reportedly, "I never found them. God help whoever they found." The case file was stored in the county courthouse basement. The Holloway cabin collapsed in a windstorm in 1905. The property was eventually sold for back taxes, and the new owners built a new house on a different part of the land, as far from the original cabin site as possible. The story began to fade from public memory, becoming a local legend, then a footnote, then nearly forgotten entirely. But the sisters hadn't been forgotten by everyone. And in 1912, something happened that suggested Sheriff Clayton's fears had been well-founded. On July 8, 1912, Chicago police investigating a reported foul odor coming from a basement apartment on the south side made a discovery that would reopen the Holloway case 15 years after the sisters had vanished. The apartment was rented to three women who gave their names as Martha, Clara, and June Weston. They claimed to be sisters, though when pressed, the landlord admitted he had never bothered to verify their relationship. They were quiet tenants who paid their rent on time and caused no trouble. They had lived there for 3 years. When police entered the apartment, after obtaining a warrant when the tenants failed to respond to wellness checks, they found a scene that was chillingly familiar to anyone who had studied the Holloway case. The apartment had been converted into a laboratory. There were books on anatomy and chemistry. There were tools. There were jars containing preserved specimens that analysis would later prove to be human tissue. There were journals filled with notes written in 3 distinct hands. And there was a hidden room behind a false wall, accessed through the bedroom closet. In that room, police found evidence of recent activity. The room had been cleaned, but luminol testing, a new forensic technique at the time, revealed extensive blood residue. The room also contained restraints bolted to the walls and floor, but the apartment was empty. The Weston sisters were gone. Chicago detectives, initially treating this as a local crime, soon made the connection to the Holloway case. The parallels were too precise to be coincidental. They contacted authorities in North Carolina and requested the old case files. When the journals from the Chicago apartment were compared to the journals from the Holloway shed, handwriting analysis confirmed they were written by the same three people. Martha, Clara, and June Holloway had been living in Chicago under assumed names for at least 3 years, and they had been active. Chicago police began investigating missing persons cases from the past 3 years. They focused on cases matching the Holloway pattern, people without strong social connections, circumstances where disappearance could be explained by other factors, victims who wouldn't be immediately or aggressively sought. They identified 7 possible victims: a homeless man who people assumed had simply moved on, an elderly immigrant woman with no family in America, a traveling salesman whose company thought he had quit, a prostitute whose disappearance wasn't investigated because such disappearances were common and often deliberately uninvestigated, 2 men who had been living in flop houses under false names, a young woman who had run away from home and whose family had stopped looking for her, 7 people who had vanished in Chicago between 1909 and 1912. 7 people whose paths, detectives theorized, had crossed with the Holloway sisters. The journals from the Chicago apartment confirmed at least 5 of these victims. The entries were similar to the earlier journals but showed evolution. The sisters had refined their techniques. They had learned from their years on the run. They had become even more careful, even more methodical, but they had also become more ambitious. Clara's entries spoke of wanting to move beyond individual subjects to studying groups. Martha wrote about the possibility of intergenerational experiments, taking whole families. June's entries had grown darker, more focused on the spiritual aspects of their work, suggesting she had become increasingly convinced that they were opening genuine doorways to other realms through their actions. The discovery triggered a massive manhunt in Chicago and surrounding areas. Detectives worked backward, trying to trace how the sisters had gotten to Chicago in the first place. They discovered that the sisters had used multiple identities over the years, had moved frequently, and had always been careful to maintain a low profile. They also discovered something else. The sisters had money. A lot of money. Bank records eventually revealed that they had been investing carefully, had multiple accounts under different names, and had accumulated significant wealth. The source of this money was unclear, possibly from robbing their victims, possibly from some legitimate business venture operated under false identities, possibly both. This wealth explained how they had managed to evade capture for so long. They had resources. They could disappear whenever necessary and establish themselves in new locations. They could afford to bide their time between killings. They could buy privacy and anonymity. The Chicago investigation continued through 1912 and into 1913, but like the original manhunt 15 years earlier, it eventually went cold. The sisters had vanished completely. Again. And once again, a letter arrived. This one was sent to the Chicago Chief of Police in September 1913. It was postmarked from New Orleans, but as before, there was no way to confirm the sisters had actually been there. The letter was longer than the first, more philosophical. It spoke about the nature of their work, about their understanding of pain and death as tools for transcendence, about their belief that they were exploring fundamental truths that society refused to acknowledge. It was articulate, intelligent, and utterly devoid of remorse or human empathy. It ended with a passage that was widely reprinted and became infamous. You believe you are hunting us, but you misunderstand the relationship. We are the hunters. We have always been the hunters. You are simply delayed in realizing what prey you have been, what prey all of you have always been. We exist in your nightmares because we are what you refuse to see in your mirrors. We are humanity without the comforting lies. We are what all people would be if they possessed the courage to act on their truest impulses. We will not be caught because we do not wish to be caught. We will continue our work because the work is important. And when we are ready, if we are ever ready, we will choose our own ending. Not you, not society, not the law. Only we decide. Only we have ever decided. Remember that as you search. Remember that you have already lost. The letter was signed with 3 initials and a symbol that appeared in the grimoires found in both the original shed and the Chicago apartment. A symbol associated with transformation through suffering. The case file was updated. The manhunt was renewed, though with diminishing enthusiasm. The sisters were now 41 years old. They had been successfully evading capture for 16 years. Many officers believed they might be dead, that they might have died in some accident, or met their end in a way that prevented their bodies from being identified. Others believed they were still out there, still hunting, still conducting their experiments on people unlucky enough to cross their path. Neither theory could be proven. The case remained open, but it became a historical curiosity rather than an active investigation. The world was changing rapidly. World War I would soon consume everyone's attention. The Holloway sisters, if they were still alive, were lost in the chaos of early 20th century America, 3 needles in an enormous haystack. But the story wasn't over. Not yet. Between 1913 and 1947, the Holloway sisters existed primarily as legend. True crime enthusiasts studied the case. Criminologists included it in textbooks as an example of female serial killers, a category that was not well understood at the time. The sensational aspects of the case, the triplets, the occult elements, the sophisticated methodology, made it irresistible to writers and researchers. But there were no verified sightings, no confirmed communications, no new evidence. There were, however, theories. The most conservative theory was that the sisters had died sometime between 1913 and 1920. Possibly they had been killed in an accident, or perhaps one of their intended victims had fought back successfully. Perhaps they had fallen victim to one of the many dangers of early 20th century life. Disease, natural disaster, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Proponents of this theory pointed out that complete disappearance was difficult even in that era. If the sisters had continued operating, evidence would have surfaced eventually. The absence of evidence suggested absence of activity, which suggested death. A minority opinion held that the sisters might have stopped killing. Perhaps they had found other outlets for their impulses. Perhaps age had mellowed them. Perhaps some psychological or spiritual crisis had led to a genuine change. This theory was popular with alienists and early psychologists who wanted to believe that even the most deviant minds could be rehabilitated. It was less popular with those who had studied the case files and read the journals. The sisters' writing showed no capacity for empathy, no internal conflict about their actions, no suggestion that they were capable of reform. This was the most disturbing theory and the one favored by most investigators familiar with the case. The sisters were still alive, still operating, but had become so sophisticated at covering their tracks that their crimes were no longer recognizable as such. They might have changed their methodology. Instead of keeping victims alive for extended periods, which increased risk, they might have moved to quicker kills. Instead of keeping journals and evidence, they might have adopted a policy of complete disposal and zero documentation. Instead of operating from a fixed location, they might have become truly nomadic, never staying anywhere long enough to establish a pattern. Under this theory, missing persons cases across America between 1913 and the 1940s might include some that were actually Holloway victims, but there was no way to identify which ones. The sisters had learned to be invisible. Some speculated that the sisters might have separated at some point, each going their own way. This would have made them even harder to track, as witnesses were looking for 3 identical women together, not 3 identical women in different locations. This theory was supported by the fact that the sisters' journals showed different personalities and motivations. Perhaps their interest had diverged enough that they chose to pursue their activities independently. However, the journals also showed deep codependency. The sisters thought of themselves as a unit. They referred to each other constantly, collaborated on everything, and seemed to derive strength from their shared identity. Separation seemed psychologically unlikely. Throughout these decades, occasional claims surfaced. In 1923, a woman in Seattle confessed on her deathbed to being June Holloway. Investigation proved she was lying, though her motivation remained unclear. In 1931, 3 elderly women living together in rural Maine briefly came under suspicion, but they were quickly ruled out. In 1938, a crime scene in Detroit bore superficial similarities to the Holloway methodology, but follow-up investigation revealed no genuine connection. The case file grew dusty in storage. The original investigators aged and died. New generations of law enforcement learned about the Holloway sisters as a historical case, not an active one. And then, in 1947, something happened that shook everyone who remembered the case. On October 31, 1947, the 71st birthday of Martha, Clara, and June Holloway, if they were still alive, the San Francisco Police Department received a package. The package was addressed to the chief of police. It had no return address and had been mailed from within the city 2 days earlier. It sat on a desk in the mailroom for a day before someone noticed it was leaking. When the package was opened carefully, because by 1947 people were wary of such things, it contained a human finger, severed recently enough that it hadn't yet fully decomposed. The finger wore a ring, later identified as belonging to a missing person named Robert Chen, a grocery store owner who had vanished 2 weeks earlier. Also in the package was a letter. The letter was typed, not handwritten, making handwriting analysis impossible. But the content left no doubt about who had sent it. To the current keepers of order, we write on our birthday, a symbolic gesture we trust you will appreciate. 71 years ago today, we entered this world. We have lived those years fully, experiencing aspects of existence that most humans glimpse only in their darkest nightmares. We send this small token to prove we remain active and capable. The subject from whom this was taken provided adequate data for our purposes before expiring. He was number 42 in our count. We began with number 1 in 1891. 56 years of productive research. We write now because we have reached a decision. We are elderly by conventional standards, though we remain healthy and sharp-minded. We have discussed at length what should become of our work when we are gone. Should it die with us? Should it be preserved in some form? Should we select students to continue it? We have concluded that our work should be documented and shared with those capable of understanding it. Not the masses who are fearful and small-minded, but serious students of human nature, philosophers of the real, those willing to look at truth without flinching. To that end, we have begun compiling our journals into a comprehensive manuscript. It will detail our methodology, our findings, our theoretical framework. It will include case studies of all 42 subjects. It will be our magnum opus, our contribution to human knowledge. When it is complete, we will decide how to release it. Perhaps we will donate it to a medical library. Perhaps we will send it to a university. Perhaps we will simply publish it ourselves and let it find its audience. We tell you this not to taunt you, though we confess to enjoying your historical failures to stop us. We tell you this because we want you to know. We won. We lived our entire lives exactly as we chose. We conducted our research without interference. We were never caught because we were smarter, more careful, and more committed than you. This is our final communication. We will not write again. When you next hear of us, it will be when our manuscript enters the world. That may be next year or in 10 years or never, depending on circumstances and our inclinations. We remain, as always, in pursuit of forbidden truths. M, C, and J. The letter caused immediate pandemonium. The FBI was called in. The Holloway case file was retrieved from archives. Investigators who had worked on the 1913 Chicago case were contacted. Those who were still alive and mentally competent. The package was analyzed for forensic evidence. The finger was indeed Robert Chen's, confirmed through fingerprints. A massive investigation was launched in San Francisco. Missing persons cases from the previous 5 years were reviewed. Any case that fit the Holloway pattern was examined in detail. Investigators identified 3 possible victims, beyond Robert Chen, 2 transients and 1 elderly woman with dementia who had wandered away from her home. But finding the sisters proved impossible. San Francisco in 1947 was a large, bustling city. Thousands of people could disappear into its population without effort. 3 elderly women living quietly under false identities would be invisible. The investigation continued for months. Resources were poured into it, but there were no leads, no witnesses came forward, no evidence surfaced beyond that single package. And then silence. Months turned into years. The sisters did not write again. No manuscript appeared, no further packages arrived. The trail went cold for what would be the final time. By the 1950s, most investigators believed the sisters were dead. If they had been alive in 1947, they would have been 71 years old, elderly by the standards of the era. They might have died since then. Or perhaps the 1947 letter had been a hoax, a cruel imitation by someone who knew the case history. But Robert Chen's finger had been real. Someone had taken it from him. Someone had sent it. And the letter had contained details about the case that had never been made public. Details only someone with access to the original evidence or someone who had been there could know. The case file was updated one last time and then filed away permanently. The Holloway sisters passed into history, or so everyone believed. I told you at the beginning that my name doesn't matter. I'm just the one who found the journals. Let me tell you how that happened. In 2019, I was working as an archivist for a small historical society in Northern California. Part of my job involved cataloging estate donations. When someone dies and their family doesn't know what to do with all their old papers and belongings, they sometimes donate them to us. In March 2019, we received a donation from the estate of a woman named Margaret Wilson. She had died at age 93, having lived her entire life in the same house in a small town I won't name here. She had been a retired librarian, never married, no children. She was remembered as quiet, reclusive, and intensely private. Among her effects were dozens of boxes of books, papers, and personal items. I was tasked with sorting through them to see if anything had historical value worth preserving. In the back of a closet, behind boxes of old National Geographic magazines, I found a locked metal trunk. The lock was old but sturdy. I consulted with my supervisor, and we decided to open it. Estate donations typically include permission to access all materials. It took a locksmith an hour to get it open without damaging the trunk. Inside were journals. 23 leather-bound journals, dating from 1891 to 1952, and a manuscript, typed on an old typewriter one night, 47 pages long. The title page read, "A Study in the Limits of Human Experience. 50 Years of Research into Pain, Death, and Transcendence." It took me about 30 minutes of reading to realize what I had found. The journals were written by Martha, Clara, and June Holloway. The manuscript was the comprehensive work they had promised in their 1947 letter. And Margaret Wilson's real name, according to a birth certificate, also hidden in the trunk, was Martha Holloway. She had been living under a false identity since at least 1913, possibly longer. She had lived quietly, worked as a librarian, been a productive member of her community, and she had continued her research until at least 1952, according to the dates of the last journal entries. The journals documented 42 victims between 1891 and 1947, as the letter had claimed. But they also documented 16 more between 1947 and 1952. 58 total, and then they stopped. The final entry, dated December 15, 1952, was written by Martha and read, "Clara died yesterday. Heart failure," the doctor said. She went quickly, which she would have hated. She who spent so much time studying prolonged endings. She was 76 years old. We had 76 years together. June and I buried her in the woods behind the house, deep enough that she will never be found. We performed the rituals. We said the words. If there is anything beyond death, if our work has opened any doors, she will find them. June and I are alone now. 2 instead of 3. It feels wrong, incomplete. We have always been 3. We are a triangle, and a triangle with one point missing is no longer a triangle. We discussed continuing without her, but neither of us has the will. Our work was collaborative. It required all 3 of us. Clara was the theorist, I was the organizer, June was the executioner. Without Clara to give our work meaning and direction, it becomes mere killing. We were never mere killers. We will preserve what we have done. We will compile the manuscript. We will keep it safe. And when we die, perhaps someone will find it. Perhaps they will understand. Perhaps they will continue what we began. Or perhaps it will be lost forever and our lifetimes of research will vanish as if they never existed. We find we do not care which outcome occurs. We did the work for its own sake, not for recognition. We remain, until the end, students of the great work. M. There were no further entries after that date. Cross-referencing with public records, I discovered that a woman named Jane Wilson, sister of Margaret, had died in 1954. Jane was June. That left only Martha, who lived another 65 years, dying in 2019 at the age of 142. Wait, that's not right. Let me recalculate. Martha, Clara, and June were born in 1876. Margaret Wilson died in 2019. That would make her 143 years old. That's impossible. People don't live that long, unless the Margaret Wilson who died in 2019 wasn't Martha, unless she was someone else who had inherited or found the journals. But the handwriting in later journals, when I had it compared to earlier ones by a forensic specialist, was consistent. It was Martha's handwriting, showing the natural changes that age brings, but unmistakably from the same person. And there are journal entries from the 1990s, from the 2000s. The last one is dated 2017, when Margaret Martha would have been 141 years old. That final entry, written in a shaky hand but still clearly Martha's, reads, "I am the last." Clara died in 1952. June died in 1954. I have carried on alone for 63 years. I am old beyond old. My body fails, but my mind remains sharp. I remember everything. I remember our first kill. I remember the shed. I remember the patterns we discovered and the theories we proved. I remember how alive we felt, how purposeful, how certain that we were doing something important. And now, at the end, I wonder, were we right? Did our work mean anything? Did we discover truths, or did we simply rationalize our own darkness? I cannot answer that question. Perhaps there is no answer. Perhaps the work was its own justification and meaning is irrelevant. I will die soon. Perhaps today, perhaps next year, but soon. The manuscript is complete. The journals are preserved. What happens to them is no longer my concern. We lived as we chose. We died having experienced what others only fear. That will have to be enough. Emu. The trunk also contained newspaper clippings from every stage of the case. Maps showing the locations of victims. Photographs, horrifying photographs that I immediately turned over to authorities. And detailed instructions for disposing of evidence, creating false identities, and evading investigation. I contacted the FBI immediately. They contacted local police in every jurisdiction where the journals indicated murders had occurred. They began the grim process of trying to identify victims and notify families. Though in many cases, families were long dead themselves and the victims had been forgotten. The case file on the Holloway sisters was officially closed in 2020. 3 of the most prolific serial killers in American history had lived, operated, and died without ever being caught. They had killed at least 58 people over a period of 61 years. They had lived to extreme old age, dying peacefully rather than facing justice. The manuscript and journals are now sealed in an FBI evidence vault. They will never be published. The photographs were destroyed. The world doesn't need to see what Martha, Clara, and June Holloway documented. But I saw it. I read every page. I know what they did, how they thought, what they believed. And I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember the victims. Someone needs to bear witness to what happened. 17 people vanished in Ridgecrest County between 1891 and 1897. They had names. They had lives. They were someone's child, someone's parent, someone's friend. They deserved better than to be subjects in 3 monsters research. 41 more people vanished between 1898 and 1952. Same story. Real people. Real lives. Real loss. The Holloway sisters were too evil for history books, not because what they did was incomprehensible, but because it was comprehensible. They weren't possessed by demons or driven by psychosis. They were simply people who chose evil, who looked at the darkness in human nature and decided to embrace it fully, who decided that their curiosity mattered more than other people's lives. That's the real horror. Not that monsters exist, but that monsters can look like three quiet, intelligent, soft-spoken women. That monsters can live among us for decades, undetected. That monsters can die peacefully in their sleep, having never paid for their crimes. Martha, Clara, and June Holloway were born on October 31st, 1876. They began killing in 1891, they stopped in 1952. Martha died in 2019, having lived 143 years, an impossibility that the journals don't explain and that I can't verify. Their story is over, but the questions they raise remain. How many others like them are out there, unknown and unsuspected? How many missing persons cases involve victims who died at the hands of killers who were never caught? How many monsters live out their entire lives without ever facing justice? I don't have answers to those questions. No one does. But I'll tell you what I do know. The mountains remember. Even when people forget, even when records are lost, even when decades pass, the mountains remember. Every scream, every secret, every soul that vanished into the mist, and somewhere in the Appalachian wilderness, where 3 states touch but no law truly reached, the wind still whispers through the ruins of a cabin that should have been a warning. Martha, Clara, and June Holloway were real. Their victims were real. And their story, as impossible as parts of it seem, is true. I found the journals. I read the manuscript. I know what they did. And now so do you. May their victims rest in peace. May their names be remembered. And may we never forget that evil doesn't always announce itself with fangs and horns. Sometimes it comes with a soft smile, a kind word, and an invitation you should never, ever accept. This is their story. All of it true. All of it documented. All of it sealed away now where it can't hurt anyone else. But the memory remains. The warning remains. Be careful who you trust. Be careful who you follow into the woods. Be careful when you accept help from strangers, no matter how harmless they seem. Because Martha, Clara, and June Holloway seemed harmless too, until they weren't. Through November, into December, it made regional newspapers. Reporters descended on Ridgecrest County, interviewing everyone who had ever encountered the Holloway sisters. They found a community in shock, unable to reconcile the polite, soft-spoken girls they had known with the monsters the evidence showed they were. Thomas Holloway gave one interview to a reporter from the Asheville Citizen. It was published on December 3, 1897. Thomas spoke about his failure as a father, about missing the signs, about choosing alcohol over vigilance. He spoke about his dead wife Sarah and wondered if she had known all along what their daughters were becoming. He wept throughout the interview. 3 days later, Thomas Holloway was found dead in his cabin. He had hanged himself from a rafter. His suicide note was brief. I brought them into this world. I should have stopped them. I should have believed Sarah. May God forgive me because I cannot forgive myself. The manhunt continues.